picture the scene. It's March in the year 1116.
Okay.
We are inside the sprawling Lateran Palace in Rome at this massive synod. Hundreds of the most powerful bishops, cardinals, theologians, they're all packed into this room.
The tension must have been completely suffocating.
Oh, absolutely. And at the front sits Pope Paschal II, the supreme leader of the Catholic Church, and he is currently giving this highly defensive speech. He's desperately trying to justify a deeply unpopular treaty he just signed with the Holy Roman Emperor.
Right, a treaty he signed while being held hostage, which is a key detail.
Exactly. So he's up there defending it, and then a bishop stands up, doesn't ask for permission. He looks directly at the Pope in front of the entire assembly and declares, I'm quoting here, "Let us praise God and give him thanks because our Lord and head repents that he had subscribed to that heresy."
Wow. I mean, it's the kind of silence that just rings in your ears, you know?
Yeah.
Calling a papal decree a heresy directly to the Pope's face in a public forum is essentially the medieval equivalent of throwing a live grenade onto the boardroom table.
And usually that is the exact moment a historical figure gets branded a traitor, excommunicated, and just, relegated to the footnotes of history.
Absolutely.
But in our stack of sources today, which includes the Catholic Encyclopedia, various historical biographies, and some deeply preserved parish records, we are tracking a man who committed this ultimate act of career suicide and somehow ended up canonized as a saint.
It's an incredible trajectory.
It really is. His name is Bruno of Segni. He was born somewhere around 1045 or 1049, and his historical legacy is often summed up with the epithet, the brilliant defender of the church.
Which is a fascinating title for a guy who rebelled against the Pope.
Right. So your mission today, as you listen to this deep dive into the source material, is to understand the mechanics of this man's life. How do you aggressively rebel against the leadership of an institution while remaining so completely devoted to the institution itself that history eventually vindicates you?
To track that code, you really have to understand the specific geopolitical war zone Bruno was born into. The 11th and 12th centuries were not just, a backdrop of generic knights and castles.
Yeah, it wasn't a fairy tale.
Not at all. It was defined by this brutal, structural tug of war between church and state, primarily over who actually held the reins of societal power. Emperors and kings believed they had a divine right to appoint bishops and abbots within their territories.
And from a purely administrative standpoint, you can kind of see why they'd want that.
Oh, for sure. Bishops weren't just spiritual guides. They were massive landholders, military commanders, tax collectors. I mean, if you're a king, you obviously want your loyalists in those positions.
But the church reformers saw the danger there.
Exactly. A rising faction of reformers realized that if the state controls who becomes a bishop, the church is effectively just a bureaucratic subsidiary of the empire.
Right, so the secular rulers are basically holding a monopoly on spiritual appointments just to consolidate their own physical power. And that ideological battleground is the world Bruno steps into. So let's look at his origins. He's born in Salero, in the Piedmont region of the Kingdom of Italy, and the sources actually give us two completely conflicting narratives about his family's socio-economic status.
They do. It's quite debated. Some early biographers place his birth into the illustrious lords of Asti.
Which would mean he was born into the highest echelons of regional nobility, right? Groomed for political power from day one.
Exactly. But then other sources, often more localized parish records, suggest he was born to parents of much more modest, perhaps merchant-class means. They specifically named them Andrea and Guglielmina.
Okay, so a pretty huge gap there.
Yeah, the exact bank account of his parents remains a bit of a mystery. But what the sources universally agree on is this defining childhood disposition.
He wasn't like other kids.
No. Bruno wasn't interested in wealth or territorial expansion. He exhibited this profound, singular belief that true happiness was only found in loving God.
Which naturally leads him to a life of serious intellectual rigor. He gets his early education at the Benedictine house of Santa Perpetua, and later studies the humanities and liberal arts at the University of Bologna.
Which was the premier intellectual hub of the era.
It was. Now, given the historical context you just laid out, a brilliant young man with his level of education in his 20s, would typically be fast-tracked into the upper management of the church, maybe angling for a prominent bishopric to secure power for his family.
That would be the standard playbook, yes.
But Bruno's worldly ambitions run in the exact opposite direction. He actively wants to drop off the grid. He sets his sights on becoming a quiet, contemplative monk at the famous Abbey of Monte Cassino.
And Monte Cassino is the absolute epicenter of Benedictine monasticism. It sits on this rocky hill southeast of Rome, and entering there meant taking a vow of stability.
So total isolation.
Yeah, it was the ultimate retreat from the political chaos of the world. He just wanted a life of copying manuscripts, chanting the Psalms, and total anonymity. But a biological twist of fate intervened.
Right. He starts his journey to enter the monastery, but while he's passing through the city of Siena, he contracts a severe, life-threatening illness. He is stranded there, completely bedridden, for months.
It's a massive detour.
And because he's stuck in the city recovering, he eventually comes to the attention of the local bishop, a man named Rudolphus. Rudolphus takes one look at this brilliant, pious young scholar who is literally washed up in his diocese, and he essentially drafts him.
He does. He makes Bruno a canon of the cathedral chapter.
Which is the exact moment the trajectory of his life permanently shifts. But let me pause on the mechanics of that, because the sources threw the term canon around. But for you listening, we really need to understand what that actually means.
That's not what most people picture.
Right, because to me, this reads like someone setting out on a road trip to join a silent meditation retreat, getting severe food poisoning in a random college town, and the dean of the university coming to the hospital and saying, hey, while you're here, we're making you the head of administration.
That analogy is highly accurate, actually. Being a canon in a cathedral chapter was not a quiet, contemplative role at all. The chapter was essentially the bishop's corporate board of directors.
Okay, so it's a very active administrative position.
Very much so. As a canon, Bruno was suddenly thrust into high-level urban administration. He was managing massive cathedral estates, resolving local legal disputes, overseeing the collection of tithes, and acting as a theological advisor to the bishop.
Wow. So much for chanting songs in silence.
Exactly. It was a rigorous education in the brutal day-to-day logistics of church governance. It forced him to develop these really sharp public speaking skills and analytical dominance. And crucially, it placed him firmly on the radar of Rome.
Right. If he had made it to Monte Cassino, he would have been completely hidden.
But in Siena, he was highly visible.
And that visibility brings us to the year 1079, the crisis event that absolutely shatters any remaining hope of a quiet life. Bruno is summoned to the 6th Roman Synod under Pope Gregory VII.
And this is not just a casual invite.
No, the Pope doesn't just want him to observe. He throws Bruno straight into the theological gladiator arena. He is tasked with publicly debating a very prominent intellectual named Berengarius of Tours.
The stakes of this debate really cannot be overstated. Berengarius was publicly denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
Okay.
He was formulating arguments against what would come to be known as the doctrine of transubstantiation. You know, the belief that the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ during the Mass.
I want to push back on why this was such a massive crisis, though, because to a modern secular ear, this just sounds like an esoteric, academic squabble over mystical symbolism.
Sure, it can sound that way today.
But structurally, within the 11th century framework, denying the real presence threatened the entire power dynamic of the church, didn't it? I mean, if the bread and wine are just symbolic, then the priest isn't performing a unique, exclusive miracle.
Precisely. You have hit on the exact structural nerve there. If the Eucharist is purely symbolic, the mystical monopoly of the priesthood basically evaporates.
Right.
The authority of the church at that time rested entirely on the premise that its ordained ministers were the exclusive conduits for literal divine grace. Berengarius wasn't just questioning a philosophical concept.
He was pulling a block out of a Jenga tower.
Yes, he was inadvertently undermining the foundational authority of the church hierarchy at a moment when the church was desperately fighting secular kings for its own independence.
Enter Bruno. He steps onto the floor of the synod, and according to the sources, he completely obliterates Berengarius' arguments. He doesn't just outshout him, he dismantles him systematically.
Using a profound mastery of sacred scripture and patristic theology.
And he argues with such undeniable logic and rhetorical force that Berengarius actually recants his heresy right there on the spot.
It is a stunning victory. Pope Gregory VII watches this young canon from Siena dismantle a major theological threat, and he realizes immediately that Bruno is a tactical asset.
He is a weapon for orthodoxy.
Yes, exactly. Gregory decides on the spot that Bruno is far too valuable to be left in Siena. He appoints him as the Bishop of Segni, which is a strategically important diocese just outside of Rome.
Which prompts a reaction from Bruno that I think is incredibly human and honestly completely contrary to how we usually view medieval ambition.
Right, he doesn't celebrate at all.
No, he is terrified. He feels utterly unworthy of the bishopric. The Pope literally has to send a mitre, the symbolic headdress of a bishop, down to Segni to force his hand and signify a direct papal command.
And when Bruno sees this, he decides to basically pull a Jonah.
Yes, he packs his things and tries to flee the city in the middle of the night.
It is the quintessential refusal of the call. But the chronicles, specifically the accounts recorded by Peter the Deacon, detail an outstanding anomaly that stops his flight.
This part is wild.
It really is. As Bruno is running away under the cover of darkness, he reportedly encounters a woman on the road, and the sources describe her as dressed in magnificent imperial regalia, and her face is shining with the brilliance of the sun.
Okay, so this supernatural figure personifies the Church of Segni itself.
Yes. And she doesn't comfort him either. She aggressively chides him. She rebukes him for being a coward and abandoning his, quote, bride.
I read this account in the source documents, and I have to admit, my modern brain immediately looks for a psychological explanation here.
Naturally.
I mean, we are looking at a man whose singular life goal was monastic silence. He's been forced into administration in Siena, forced into a high-stakes theological debate in Rome, and now forced into a bishopric. He is buckling under the weight of unwanted authority.
Oh, the stress must have been immense.
Right. Isn't it highly probable that this vision is just a psychological stress fracture? Like his own deeply ingrained sense of duty manifesting as a literal guilt trip in the dark?
That is a very valid modern diagnostic lens.
Yeah.
But whether you interpret the event as a literal miraculous apparition or a profound psychological projection born of cognitive dissonance, the historical result is identical.
It worked.
It worked perfectly. The vision serves as the ultimate catalyst. It completely reframes the office of bishop for him. It shifts from being a bureaucratic burden that he can outrun to a sacred marriage that he cannot abandon.
Struck by this encounter, Bruno physically turns around, walks back to Segni, and accepts his consecration from Pope Gregory VII in 1080.
And from that moment on, he is locked in.
But he is locked into a world where being a bishop is basically an extreme contact sport. The sources show him becoming an indispensable confidant and advisor to 4 consecutive popes.
He's appointed as the librarian of the Holy Roman Church, too.
Yeah, and in 1095, he travels with Pope Urban II to the Council of Clermont, which is this massive historical milestone where the First Crusade is officially inaugurated. So he is operating at the absolute zenith of global power.
But operating at that altitude makes him a primary target. Remember the investiture controversy we discussed earlier?
The war between the Pope and the Emperor over church appointments.
Exactly. That war frequently went hot. Emperor Henry IV repeatedly laid siege to Rome to assert his dominance, and Bruno, as a high-profile papal loyalist, suffered immensely for it.
Right, during one of these chaotic periods, Bruno is ambushed while traveling and kidnapped by a local nobleman named Adolfo di Segni.
Just a local lord deciding to take a bishop hostage.
Adolfo was a partisan of the emperor, and he wanted to usurp the temporal lordship of Segni away from the bishopric. So he throws Bruno into a dark dungeon for 3 brutal months, trying to break his resolve and force him to sign away the diocese's lands.
But Bruno refuses to yield an inch.
Which is astounding, but that wasn't even his most severe captivity. Later on, Emperor Henry IV returns with a massive army for a devastating 7-month siege of Rome itself.
The fighting is so fierce, and the city is so thoroughly overrun, that Pope Gregory VII is actually forced to retreat.
Yeah, he barricades himself inside the Castel Sant'Angelo, which is essentially this massive fortified Roman mausoleum, and who is locked inside that fortress, starving alongside the Pope, Bruno of Segni.
You really have to visualize the mechanics of a 7-month medieval siege. It is a slow, agonizing process of starvation, disease, and psychological terror.
They are completely cut off from the outside world.
Listening to the emperor's forces ravage the city below them. Experiencing that level of visceral trauma alongside the Pope doesn't just build loyalty, it radicalizes you.
It forged in Bruno an absolute zero-tolerance policy for any compromise with imperial power. He saw firsthand the violence the state would inflict to control the church.
Which makes his next major career milestone in 1107 feel like a desperate grasp for peace.
It really does. After decades of surviving dungeons, sieges, and international diplomacy, Bruno finally gets his childhood wish. The monks at Monte Cassino elect him as their abbot, the ultimate quiet retreat.
But the Pope at the time, Paschal II, refuses to let him go completely.
He allows Bruno to become abbot, but incredibly forces him to retain his title and duties as the Bishop of Segni.
This was a deeply controversial practice known as pluralism, holding multiple high-level church offices simultaneously. It was a logistical nightmare.
A nightmare is putting it lightly. Think about the bandwidth required here. The people of Segni were actually furious. They formally complained to the Pope that their bishop had abandoned them to go live in a monastery.
So the Pope had to broker this highly specific compromise where Bruno was required to leave the cloister and actively serve the Roman Church for 40 days every single year.
So you have a man trying to manage the spiritual and economic health of the most prestigious monastery in Europe, while still legally responsible for a diocese that is constantly under threat from local warlords.
It concentrates an immense amount of structural power in one man. As bishop and abbot, Bruno's theological voice carried almost unmatched weight.
Which is exactly why, when the ultimate crisis hit in 1111, his reaction was so devastating to the papacy. Let's set the board for this final showdown. The new emperor, King Henry V, decides he is done negotiating.
He marches on Rome, invades the city, and violently kidnaps Pope Paschal II along with 16 of his highest cardinals.
He holds the Pope captive for 61 days under brutal conditions.
The emperor's demand is simple. Sign a treaty granting the secular empire the absolute right to invest bishops with a ring and crozier.
To put this in modern terms, this is a hostile corporate takeover. The emperor is demanding the legal right to appoint the entire board of directors for the church, and he's holding a knife to the CEO's throat to get the paperwork signed.
Exactly.
And under extreme physical duress, seeking to end the bloodshed and secure his release, Pope Paschal II breaks. He caves. He signs the Concordat of Ponte Momolo, historically referred to as the Privilegium. He officially hands the emperor the rights of lay investiture.
When the news reaches Bruno at Monte Cassino, his reaction is thermonuclear. To Bruno, the Pope hasn't just signed a bad political treaty. He has surrendered the mystical independence of the Bride of Christ to a violent warlord.
So Bruno immediately launches this massive, aggressive letter-writing campaign. He bypasses the normal channels and writes directly to cardinals, regional bishops, and to the Pope himself.
He publicly brands the treaty as treacherous, violent, and fundamentally heretical.
And he signs these letters with a very specific pointed sign-off that I find fascinating. Bruno Peccator Episcopus, Servus Benedicti, Bruno the Sinner Bishop, and Slave of Saint Benedict.
It's so pointed.
Right. He is contrasting his own lowliness with the Pope's failure. He's basically saying, I am a flawed sinner, but I am a servant of the faith, while you, the Pope, have made yourself a servant of the emperor.
It is a brilliant, devastating rhetorical tactic. He is using his own humility as a weapon against papal authority.
Which brings us right back to the scene we opened with, March 1116, the Lateran Council. Pope Paschal II is standing in front of the synod, attempting to explain that he only signed the treaty to save lives, that it was a moment of weakness under duress.
And Bruno stands up in front of everyone and publicly forces the Pope to admit the decree was heretical. He corners the Supreme Pontiff in his own palace.
The uproar in the synod was deafening. The Pope had been publicly humiliated by his own subordinate, and Paschal II retaliates with the only weapon he has left against Bruno.
He strips him of power.
The Pope revokes Bruno's pluralism. He officially fires him from his beloved abbacy at Monte Cassino and orders him to leave the monastery immediately and return to his desk at Segni.
This is the moment I want you to really focus on if you're listening, because this is where the modern understanding of rebellion completely breaks down.
Bruno just waged a massive, successful insurgency against the Pope. He rallied the entire church to force the Pope to reverse an international treaty.
But the moment the Pope uses his structural authority to fire Bruno from his dream job,
Bruno doesn't fight back. He doesn't raise an army. He doesn't start a splinter church. He packs his bags, leaves Monte Cassino on October 13th, 1111, and humbly rides back to Segni. He accepts the punishment entirely.
that is the precise mechanism of his worldview. Bruno was absolutely ruthless in his defense of the truth, the theological integrity of the church, but he maintained a pristine obedience to the structure of the church.
He could violently oppose the flawed actions of the man sitting in the chair of Peter while completely submitting to the authority of the chair itself.
He rebelled against the heresy, not the hierarchy.
He spends his final days quietly discharging his pastoral duties in Segni, completely out of the geopolitical spotlight. The sources vary slightly on his exact date of death, listing July 3rd, July 18th, or August 31st, but he dies of natural causes in the summer of 1123.
But his quiet exit from the stage wasn't the end of his influence. History and the institution he fought so hard to protect ultimately vindicated him.
The issue of lay investiture was definitively resolved in the Church's favor just a few years later at the Concordat of Worms.
But more lastingly, Bruno's intellectual legacy flourished. His theological works, particularly his commentaries on the Eucharist, which he defended back in 1079, set the gold standard for medieval theology.
We still have 145 of his preserved homilies, alongside major masterworks on the Gospels, the Psalms, and the Book of Job.
And his ultimate vindication arrived in 1181 or 1183, depending on the manuscript, when Pope Lucius III officially canonized him.
Today, his body rests in the Cathedral Santa Maria Assunta in Segni, where his feast day is celebrated every year on July 18th.
His life maps a truly staggering trajectory. From a reluctant intellectual fleeing his own promotion in the dark, to a prisoner of war enduring a brutal siege, to a defiant truth-teller who brought an emperor's treaty to its knees.
When you think about it, it is incredibly rare to find someone who possesses the courage to torch their own career, to speak an uncomfortable truth to power. But it is even rarer to find someone who can accept the consequences of that truth-telling with total humility.
Which leaves us with a genuinely fascinating historical puzzle to mull over. When we look at the broad sweep of history, we see multiple figures who publicly defied the Pope.
Think of Martin Luther, for example.
Right, who also stood up against what he saw as systemic corruption. Yet history remembers Bruno of Segni as a canonized saint, and Martin Luther as a heretical schismatic.
So it raises a provocative question for you to explore.
It really does. It raises this question about the anatomy of reform. Does the line between a saintly reformer and a dangerous radical have less to do with the truth of their initial defiance and everything to do with whether they are willing to let the institution break them rather than choosing to break the institution?
That is a profoundly heavy distinction. The truth might set you free, but your reaction to the fallout determines your legacy. Thanks for exploring the source material with us today.